My name is Allison Cohen, and the title of today's talk is Why Take a Unidimensional Approach to Tools That Exist in High-Dimensional Space. And that's just a very nerdy way of saying that AI tools are highly complex, and we should therefore take a complex approach to building them. So I'm really excited to be here with you today, and that's because whether you're an AI skeptic or an AI enthusiast, I think everyone here can agree that AI technology is amazing. When some people walk down the downtown core of a major city, they can be impressed by skyscrapers that seem to extend far above the clouds. But in the future, we'll marvel at how those same skyscrapers have integrated AI algorithms that can analyze things like pollution metrics and weather patterns in order to regulate the building's energy consumption. Now, the reason AI is so impressive is because, frankly, it replicates something that is so revered in societies around the world, which is human intelligence. In fact, I believe that AI is the only application in human history that has ever rivaled something that is so deeply cherished while also being so uniquely human. And rather than stifling its development out of envy or existential outrage, governments around the world are investing billions of dollars to see AI grow. And grow it has in industries like policing, hiring, education, and healthcare. But the problem that I'm seeing, and the one that I want to talk to you about today, is that much like the approach a contractor might take when building a skyscraper, too often we as AI developers are approaching the problem of building AI as something that is purely technical, purely engineering. But unfortunately, that approach is a watered-down abstraction of what it actually means to be creating AI that works well in practice. What we need is to acknowledge the multidisciplinarity of this technology and to integrate that knowledge into the approach we're taking to building our tech. So to illustrate what I mean by this, to give you a couple examples of some of the complex problems that AI is solving, I want to talk about 3 applications. The first is the fact that we're building AI tools that can determine the creditworthiness of people who had previously been unbanked. We're also developing AI tools that can recommend ways of better structuring your email so that you can communicate better with colleagues. And finally, we're developing AI tools that can help you navigate challenging ethical dilemmas that you might be facing. But let's think for a second about the AI tool that is designed to assess the creditworthiness of people who haven't previously been banked. Would it make sense that the people developing those algorithms be based in North America and never have operated outside of the traditional credit system? Would it make sense that they were the ones deciding what variables made the most sense for models to pay attention to when determining whether someone was worthy of accessing credit? Probably not. Now, what about the algorithm that could help you change the way that you communicate in your emails in light of research that they had done on ways that resonated most with colleagues in your communication? Would it make sense that those models learned exclusively on data taken from communications on Wall Street, among Wall Street brokers, for example? And finally, what about the ethical advice giving AI? Would it make sense that the data labeling work was outsourced to people who didn't understand local conceptions of morality? My point here is that designing an AI involves lots of decisions. Decisions about what data is relevant, decisions about what labels are accurate, and decisions about what expertise should be hard-coded. These decisions are too often made without an awareness of the problem's complexity or how to integrate that complexity into the AI design process. So to demonstrate the misconception of AI as a purely technical tool, I want you to imagine a continuum. This continuum can be used to plot a whole bunch of tools that we as humans use. But on one side of the continuum, you'll find things that are fairly unidimensional, purely technical in their design and application. And on the other side of this continuum, you'll find something a little bit more complex, like art, for example. So here's my continuum. I want to suggest to you that on this continuum, we have, again, something highly unidimensional, like a wrench, for example, and then something much more complex on the other side. And this is, I know it looks like a urinal, but this is actually art, and I'll get to that. I would argue that the wrench is fairly unidimensional in its application, in the sense that it's very clear how the wrench is used. Its existence doesn't suggest anything particularly meaningful about society other than the fact that we have things that need to be fixed. And finally, it has a timeless quality to it. You can use it at any time in the future, and its purpose will be quite similar. The wrench is notably different from art. Art doesn't have a clear use or purpose. Its existence is incredibly revealing about the society in which we live. And finally, it does have this timely quality to it, where it's very much engaging with the time period in which it was created, almost acting as an artifact of that time period. Now, what we have here, I know, again, it looks like an upside-down urinal. This is called Fountain by Duchamp. It's a piece of art from 1917, engaging with popular notions of what art really is at the time. It was sort of a renegade piece in the sense that it challenged what people believed art to be, which was something that was purely aesthetic. And this piece of art challenged people to see art as something that engaged in intellectually stimulating thought. So, I mean, this really, it's not just a urinal, right? That's the beauty of art, unlike the wrench, which really just is a wrench. So I would argue that on this continuum, applied AI projects are much more similar to art than they are to the wrench. AI is something that it's not obvious how to use it. It's something that we as a society define. It's also something that says a lot about our society in practice. It tells us a lot about our own beliefs and values. And finally, I would argue that it also has a very time-bound quality to it. But if I haven't convinced you yet, let me walk you through it very quickly. So first of all, when it comes to the wrench, again, very obvious when it is to be used, whether it's a broken pipe or a situation with nuts and bolts that I've never actually had to deal with. It's supposed to be very straightforward. But when it comes to artificial intelligence, it's really us as a society that decides when AI ought to be used. It's us that decides whether AI makes sense in a given context. We decide whether legacy data has something meaningful to say about the future. We decide whether we feel we want certain outcomes to be systematically reproduced. And we decide whether AI has met a level of confidence that make us feel confident that it can be deployed in the real world. Now, moving on to defined by social context, in the case of art, a viewer can infer a whole set of human experiences, beliefs, dreams, hopes for the future that humans have by looking and analyzing a piece of art. In a similar way, we can deduce an unbelievable amount of information about humanity when we analyze a piece of AI. For example, we can learn about our socioeconomic structures. I mean, if you look at the face of AI right now, it is too often white and male, which speaks to things like systemic racism, wealth inequality, and gender norms. We can also learn about the financial interests of the time because so often those with financial power are those that can define what sort of problems we want AI to solve. And finally, AI can give us insight into popular notions of morality and ethics by looking at what rights and freedoms were systematically upheld and which were compromised in the course of deploying our tool. Now, the final layer of complexity comes from whether the tool is rooted in time. The wrench was developed in 1835 and has been used for the exact same purpose ever since. Art, by contrast, is constantly evolving. I would suggest that AI is also a product of the time in which it was built. It's the technology of the time that determines what data we have access to. It's the social norms and standards of the time that determine what data we actually are willing to use in our models. And finally, it's the time-bound beliefs about what we should be prioritizing that defines what the models predict and what those models are paying attention to. So step one is simply to acknowledge that this technology is complex and it can't be built using a tech-first approach. But what does that actually mean in practice? Well, when it comes to AI, these are just some of the dimensions that you're going to have to navigate. There is an infinite number of dimensionality to properly solving an AI problem. But how do we navigate all of these dimensions? How do we navigate that type of space? Well, I would argue that there is a three-pronged approach, what I call 3 points of inflection for you to reflect on as you undergo the AI development process. The first is values. The second is people, the people sitting around your table building this tool with you. And the last is process. I'll walk through all three of those. So let's start with values. When I say values, what I mean is the beliefs in the underlying priorities of your project. And the reason that values are so important is because over the course of your project, you're going to be making lots of decisions. And the values that your team holds will orient the way that you make those decisions. Now, you might tell me that your team never sat down to think through what your values would be, and that therefore your tool must be value agnostic. And to you I say, if you don't choose your values will choose you. And that's because there's an unbelievable amount of interests at stake when it comes to building an AI project. Whether those come in the form of KPIs or financial incentives, or are simply the implicit beliefs held by people on your project. Those values are there and they will have an impact in the decisions that you make. To give you an example, one of the projects that I'm working on now is an AI-powered search engine. This tool is built to help people navigate changing trends in AI-related laws and policies globally. It presents the user with publications, research, laws, policies on all things AI governance. One of the features of our tool is an AI summary, an AI-powered summarization. So the idea is that a user can log on to our search engine, type in a question they have, and we are able to use AI in order to power a concise summary for them in response to their research question. But in building our AI-powered summary, we had to think through a number of questions. Things like, well, if we're going to summarize this information, who's an authority in this space? Who can we rely on to provide an authoritative response to the question that the user asked? Should we be integrating marginalized perspectives in that summary as well? And given that our AI models speak English exclusively, are we comfortable with the fact that the response might end up being something that is Western-centric, Western-focused? I think these questions, they get back to your values, and they shouldn't be taken lightly, because at the end of the day, what information you present to the viewer will be how they think about their research, which will influence the course of their work and potentially even the AI laws and policies of tomorrow. In that context, which I would say is relatively high stakes, it's concerning to think about the fact that critical perspectives, marginalized perspectives, are often systematically quieted. And that's because critical perspectives are often coming from communities that are under-resourced and therefore don't have the same platform to advocate for themselves. And the mainstream perspectives may not always consider how a system is working to the detriment of a particular community as well. So in the context of AI tools, where what you see is what is statistically dominant in the data set, you have to be very intentional about whose perspectives you want elevated and whose perspectives you want quieted. So, of course, we had to go back to our values when navigating all of these questions. Given that what we value most is accountability, we would be shooting ourselves in the foot by only elevating the perspectives of those that are economically enfranchised, people who are already commonly resourced, commonly referenced, commonly cited, and may not have an interest in challenging the status quo. And since we valued accountability, we decided that the best approach would be to give our users a bias warning, alerting them to the fact that both our AI models as well as the content that they're reading, it's steeped in bias that's both computer and human generated. We also decided to use filters that would allow them to search for people, organizations, and countries that are not commonly represented in traditional search results. What's interesting about filters is that filters are a way to naturally bias your search in the sense that they systematically exclude certain types of information while priming you to be exposed to other types of information. But what we did is we used filters as a way of filtering in, as a way of exposing people to underrepresented beliefs and ideas and voices in order to make our tool more inclusive. Now, we believe that these design decisions, which promote research into alternative perspectives, would allow our tool to achieve the values that we had set out for it, which were that of justice and accountability. But what I hope this story shows is that at the end of the day, the values that you bring to the project are the values that become systematically encoded and reproduced by your tool. As you can see, it's important to be intentional about your values because we live in a system where there are many institutions of power that we need to navigate. And those systems of power will have a bearing on how our tools work in practice. So once you've clarified your values, it's time to think about your people. To illustrate how important it is to have strong people around the table, I want you to imagine what a very bad team would look like. So I want to give you an example. Imagine, for example, you were building an AI tool that could detect subtle forms of bias against Jewish people in email communication, let's say. Now, I'm Jewish, and over the years, I've picked up on all of the different ways that bias might be expressed against Jewish people. It can be very subtle, it can be not so subtle, but it's something that I've had to experience with time to fully grasp and understand. But let's imagine for a second that I'm not on this team, and instead this team is comprised of Christian computer scientists from Iceland, where the population of Jews is 0.0006%. How well do you think their models would do at identifying subtle forms of bias against Jewish people? I'm going to guess not very well. Not very well. And, one of the tools that I'm actually building now is an AI-powered model that can identify subtle forms of bias. Not against Jewish people, but against women. And the team that I've assembled to build this tool with me are a linguist, a gender studies expert, someone who specializes in AI in the context specifically of gender, and an AI ethicist. Oh yeah, and all of these people are women. So, I think that we need to acknowledge that these people that we bring onto the project, they need to be sensitized to the communities that we're deploying these tools within, but also the communities that we're claiming to have a strong grasp of. Communities that become, understood and identified through our algorithms. And that's why I've assembled this team of people that can define misogyny and where we can find it, that can determine what words signal misogyny and how we can systematically collect it. It's this team that can identify the know-how that's needed to label our data set and how to access it. And it's also this team that can determine the standard of performance that our tools need to meet and how we can achieve it. Again, this is something that really requires a strong understanding of the people and the application of this tool. I heard a really strong quotation recently, which is that diverse perspectives are diverse. And we need to represent at least some of that diversity on the teams that we're building our technology with, both in terms of expertise, but also in terms of lived experience. Otherwise, our tools will be ignorant to the realities on the ground, which is where our tools are being deployed. Now, it's one thing to bring a diverse set of perspectives to the table, but it's quite another to meaningfully integrate those perspectives onto your team. And that's the final element of my presentation, which is really about process. The reason it's important to think about process is because, frankly, we can be developing all sorts of AI tools in whatever AI labs around the world we want, but unless we have a deep understanding of what it's like to be in the position of people that might be using our tools, we'll never be able to create something meaningful. So I'll give you a sense of that. I'm working now on a project called Project Infrared that's designed to identify victims of human trafficking on the online escort market. Again, this project it's quite heavy. I mean, it's something that people deal with every day in the context of horrifying conditions, and yet it's something that we're building in this ivory tower. There's an unbelievable amount that we need to understand about what it's like to be a human trafficking victim that is simply unknowable unless we integrate those perspectives onto our team. So our team decided to attend a 2-day workshop where we learned what it meant to engage with the survivors in a survivor-centric way. In this workshop, we discussed how important it was to consider survivors in a really empowering way, because what we needed to do was to define the way that we would bring them into our project, not just as consultants for hire, but as people whose presence on our project meant something for their reintegration story. We learned that the process needed to be incredibly holistic in that way. Our job was to create a safer environment, one where they could feel free and safe to share their perspectives and experiences, which involved having us look deeply and critically at our organization's culture and any oppressive norms that we might perpetuate. This process allowed us to engage in a trusting partnership with the survivors, rather than an extractive one. And again, the elements of this relationship had to be defined by the survivors we were working with. This couldn't come from our own preconceived notions of what it meant to be meaningfully engaging with this community. Now, I recognize that not all AI products will require the input of a human trafficking survivor. But the point is, you will be consulting with a variety of stakeholders, and it's important to understand from their perspective what it means to be a valued member of your team. Because it's only when you understand that you can create the space and the empowerment that's needed for them to have real influence over your project's design. Without taking a thoughtful approach to diversity, that diversity will end up just being tokenization, and that tokenization is simply not enough. Now, what I appreciate about all of these points of inflection is, again, they allow you to navigate the high-dimensional space in which your tool is operating. They give you the control to determine how your tool is used, how it will navigate systems of power and oppression, and also give you the power to create something that can define a generation, define a time period. Now, I want to share with you a little bit of information about myself just before I close. You might be able to tell from the fact that I haven't talked too much about the technical details of my work that I actually don't have a technical background. In fact, I did an undergraduate degree in international development, and I did my master's in global affairs. I was lucky enough to do an internship in Israel where I worked with Palestinians and Israelis advocating for people that were in detention to be free from torture. This is actually a photo of me from my time in Sri Lanka, where I worked for a local ministry trying to create institutions to help with the country's reconciliation efforts following their civil war. Now, most people give me a puzzled look when I tell them about this background and say, what must have gone wrong for you to end up in AI? And the answer that I commonly tell them is that AI is technical, of course, but it's also political, and it's social, and it's economic. The stakeholders are varied and multidisciplinary, and the output has consequences that extend far past any geographic region. The field of AI is about computer science, without a doubt, but it's also about power, wealth, social change, and sustainable development. In order for us to seize this technology's potential, we must not treat it as if it were value agnostic and independent from people's choices and decisions. We need to recognize that AI must be thoughtfully, constructively, and inclusively built in a way that reflects its art-like dimension. Otherwise, we'll be squandering one of the most impressive achievements of the 21st century, one of the few achievements that can dwarf that of the skyscraper.
First of all, when you've been speaking about values, you mentioned that values should be chosen in order to not to choose the person who chooses it. And you mentioned one point which seems to me controversial. At some point, you use the same word, marginal groups. And at the same time, you said that some marginal opinions, for example, racism and stuff like this, and sexism and anti-Semitism, for example, should be excluded, but at the same time, different marginal opinions for people who are underrepresented are also marginal. Who should decide which values should be chosen? Only one person? Because you mentioned values before people, or people after values.
You make a really good point, which is that it's people that define values, and you need to be very aware of the people that are defining those values. And frankly, right now, it is up to people in the sense that there's very little regulation that tells you exactly who should be defining the values of your project or even what objective values of your project should be. And I guess my perspective takes for granted that there are good-intentioned people around the table defining the values. For me, the values have come from the organization that I'm working with, which is Mila. And the values really start with inclusivity and impact and meaning around the world and not creating anything that's net problematic. But it may be the case that organizations have very different values. In fact, like I mentioned, a lot of those incentives and values can come purely from an economic perspective. And so if that is the case, I would say that it's important to navigate the institution that you're working with to better understand what the priorities are. And then, frankly, if you're prepared to carry through with those priorities and those values, then unfortunately we don't have, much infrastructure right now to deter you from doing something problematic. But I think that then comes back to we need to be aware of the organizations that we're working with and the types of values that they bring to the work that they do.
Your statement that underrepresentation and lack of inclusivity of some particular social groups at the community which develop in some software, like you mentioned, I don't remember, New Zealand software developers?
Oh, Iceland.
Yeah, Iceland. So seems to me to be based on the idea of natural state of xenophobia of people, which declares that absence of some social groups intrinsically and naturally leads to biases against the social groups. Because difference between example you propose an example of sexism, that women exist in the society where they are underrepresented, while Jewish people, Jewish community does not really represented in entire country. And whether or not it really leads to development of bias against Jewish people or not, for being more precise, like in case of development of product for the country, because for international development, I guess there will be outsource, which will guide and share the guidelines for development in different countries where different social structure and different things. What do you think about it? Like on a little bit meta level about people, whether the biases are intrinsic part of the nature or it's imposed, and when you think about biases in groups where these biased and underrepresented groups doesn't exist, it still will be like, how it's called, mistreated.
First of all, I want to acknowledge that I think we do all have biases, and it's important to think about what biases people might have that are sitting around your table and how that might influence the work that they do on your project. But I sort of think because that's a given, we have to be reflecting on, well, in light of the fact that there are these biases that exist, which frankly to me signal a blind spot, an unawareness, an easy categorization that doesn't capture the nuance of a people or whatever it is you might be talking about. It's important to have people who do represent a certain community, especially the community that's either the direct user of your tool or a community that might be implicated by your tool's use, because sometimes those aren't the same communities. But the idea is you need to make sure that whoever your tool is targeting, at least some representation from that community is engaged with your tool's design, because unfortunately, bias is everywhere. But you can be sure that if no one on your team is a member of the community where your tool is being deployed, that bias is going to create even more problematic implications.
Currently, not all organizations think or implement AI the way you actually advocate for. Not all AI practitioners or project managers are aware of it, or actually, even if they have the best intentions, are so incentivized to do so otherwise. So how do we actually ensure that or push for that these practices are actually implemented in the current process of AI development on the project?
Oh, this is great. So frankly, it is the Wild West, like you said, and people don't often know the right approach to bring to their AI development process. And in fact, I didn't either. When I started developing some of this technology, I was luckily surrounded by very well-intentioned people and great resources that guided me in understanding what was necessary to build something that would be meaningful on the ground. That being said, I think what we are seeing is a lot of AI tools being developed that aren't achieving their goals. And luckily, what that comes with is horrible PR crises, where people are, being called out for not doing a good enough job at engaging with citizens that would be impacted by the tool, or that they didn't have the right people on the team and that therefore the tool didn't do a good job at recommending who would be good for an interview, for example. And I think the more and more that we see that type of negative press around AI, the more that companies are going to look for alternative ways to build this technology that will allow them to do something that is more impactful. Because, again, even if you don't value human rights, at the end of the day, your financial interests will be dependent on you having respected human rights enough for people to respect the use of your tool, because otherwise they simply won't use it. So I think luckily we do have sort of a feedback loop, but that depends on quality journalism and people being aware and caring about the fact that some of their rights and freedoms can be hurt by some of the tools being deployed today. But I'm hopeful that's happening.
Donc, tout d'abord, merci beaucoup pour cette conférence super pertinente. Je pense que ça vient vraiment rejoindre ce que moi j'ai entendu dans beaucoup de conférences jusqu'à maintenant, le fait qu'on développe beaucoup le côté technologique, mais on semble un peu ou beaucoup en arrière pour ce qui est du côté un peu plus social. Donc, on a regardé le fait que il faut regarder comment naviguer en fait dans le monde de l'intelligence artificielle d'un côté qui est plus multidimensionnel, parce qu'en ce moment, nos gouvernements et les gouvernements à travers le monde en fait investissent des milliards de dollars en intelligence artificielle. mais les développeurs, en fait, l'approchent surtout d'un point de vue technologique, ce qui n'est pas nécessairement en lien avec les meilleures pratiques. Donc, il faudrait approcher ça d'un point de vue plus multidimensionnel, comme on a vu sur le continuum. Donc, de regarder toutes les décisions qui sont impliquées et de savoir quelle expertise, en fait, on veut qui soit codée, puis qui on veut aller consulter. Donc, l'intelligence artificielle serait plus du côté de l'art, par son usage abstrait, donc l'utilisation parfois floue qu'on en fait, dans le sens que c'est nous qui décide qu'est-ce qui fait sens, si on veut que la sortie de données soit répliquée et le niveau de confiance acceptable qu'on tolère. Ensuite, l'intelligence artificielle est aussi définie par le contexte social, donc c'est le reflet en fait de notre société, de notre vision. On l'a vu étant donné que ça se reflète beaucoup et on espère de moins en moins, mais avec l'homme blanc dominant et les intérêts financiers souvent derrière. Et on a vu aussi que c'était très lié au temps, dans le sens que c'est toujours en évolution et en lien avec les normes d'accès. Ensuite, pour un peu contrer tout ça, on nous a proposé de prendre conscience que le problème d'intelligence artificielle est complexe et que ça peut pas être tellement approché par le côté technologique, comme on dit. Donc, il fallait réfléchir à 3 choses. Premièrement, on voulait réfléchir aux valeurs, donc aux croyances sous-jacentes du projet, parce qu'on a dit que si vous choisissez pas vos valeurs, après ma barre, c'est elles qui vont vous choisir. Donc, que ce soit les croyances implicites que vous avez ou les croyances plutôt financières. On a insisté sur le fait que c'était pas des questions à prendre à la légère, qu'il fallait intégrer les perspectives critiques et marginalisées pour pas contribuer au détriment de ces perspectives. La conférencière nous a expliqué qu'eux, ils fonctionnaient surtout en appliquant des filtres pour contrôler les biais, puis peut-être élever les voix de ceux qui sont normalement diminués. Ensuite, après avoir réfléchi aux valeurs, on a dit qu'il fallait réfléchir aux personnes, donc l'importance d'avoir une bonne équipe, une équipe qui est forte, une équipe qui est sensibilisée et une équipe qui est diversifiée. Donc, il faut être capable de détecter les biais qui peuvent être parfois subtils. Et on a terminé, après avoir réfléchi aux valeurs, aux personnes, à réfléchir au processus, donc comprendre le point de vue des utilisateurs. Donc, soit en adoptant une approche qui est plus patient-partenaire, en intégrant des consultants ou en participant à des conférences et des ateliers, pour rendre ces personnes-là une partie intégrante du développement du projet.